Good morning. So we, as I'm sure everybody knows by this point, we've been going through the story. It lays out the Bible from Genesis to Revelation in chronological order and focuses really just on the overarching story of God's plan of salvation. Now today we're actually reaching a bit of a milestone. This is the last chapter covering the Old Testament, chapter 21. Now, credit where credit is due, there's a preacher named Travis Eads who wrote a lesson on this story, and I borrowed from him, especially this little story I'm going to tell about him and his kid. He said his daughter Annie invited him on a daddy-daughter date. And the plan involved picking her up a few minutes before school let out, which he's pretty sure was the real reason, so they could go watch this new animated movie called Sing. If you haven't watched it, you should watch it. My kids do love this movie, and I love it, and it's fun. It's musical. Anyway, for whatever reason, Travis and his daughter Annie ended up being the only ones in the whole theater. Probably because they went before school was even out. Annie found that so exciting. And she even told her dad, "Daddy, you don't have to turn your phone off because there's no one here to distract." Interesting logic. An hour and a half after the movie starts, which you would think should be plenty of time to solve any problem in a kid's movie, the plot takes this unexpected twist. The main characters found themselves in a big mess. And then in their attempts to clean it up, they make the mess even bigger. And so Travis is sitting there and he's worried that either this movie is going to be a lot longer than an hour and a half, or he just scarred his 9-year-old daughter by taking her to the first Greek tragedy written for kids. He says, "Annie, we might as well just leave now. This thing is over." She didn't even flinch. She ignored him. She just kept watching because she apparently had more faith in the writers than her daddy. Now, Travis will speak up in his defense and say, in my defense, I didn't see any way for this movie to end well. He just wanted his happy ending, and he wanted it right now, but all he saw was this big mess. Have you ever found yourself in a mess? I mean, of course, right? Life can be so messy. And maybe you're like the characters in this movie. You tried to fix your own mess and made it messier. I have done that more times than I care to admit. Ask my wife. Life is messy. People are messy. Maybe it's a financial mess, or maybe a mess of a marriage, a mess of addiction of some kind, a mess of family relationships. We've seen a lot of that over the last few years because of COVID and the political upheaval and things. Just mess. Our world is messy. Maybe your mess isn't one that you made, it's just the result of living in a messy world. Like I said, messy politics that maybe leave you wondering how it's all going to turn out. Or messy relationships that leave you bitter and angry and confused. Have you ever found yourself thinking, where could the story possibly go from here? How could this possibly turn around? Is there any chance at a happy ending? Is there a chance to start over? If so, where do we start? We're going to look at chapter 21 of the story today, which centers on the events of Nehemiah and the nation of Israel, who needed to do some starting over of their own. So let's talk quickly about how we got here in the story. We've discussed it before, but the Bible is something called a meta-narrative. It's a big story made up of a bunch of little stories. Or another way to put that the authors of the story like to say is there's the upper story and the lower story. The upper story is God's story of pursuing his people to bring them back into a relationship with him. That is the overarching narrative of the Bible. And then you have the lower story, which is stories of how those things are lived out through his people. That's all the little stories you find throughout the Bible that make up the big story. And if we're honest, most of the time, the lower story just seems like a big mess, right? When we read about the way people live these things out, man, it seems messy. Over the last 21 chapters, we have seen a lot of points in history where God could have easily decided to just scrap the whole plan. And who could have blamed him? Adam and Eve, they rejected God's plan. Instead of displaying his glory, they wanted it for themselves. Abraham, this guy who's chosen to build a nation, more than once lied about his wife Sarah and called her his sister because he was afraid. Jacob, he was a pathological deceiver. Moses, he had a bit of a temper when you read the times that he flares up, even killing a man one time. King David, he committed adultery and then murdered her husband to cover it up. The prophets, they dealt with depression, impurity, unfaithful spouses, and broken families. And we see the nation of Israel turn away from God and become divided. So many times God could have given up. And if it had been my choice, I would have. So thank goodness it wasn't up to any of us, right? Now the nation of Israel divided, but they were never without hope because God was never without a plan. But their disobedience came at a really high cost. We've talked about this recently, but in 586 BC, their homeland was ravaged by the Babylonians. Solomon's temple was destroyed, and people were taken into exile. And this is a point where you sit and you think, where could the story possibly go from here? If this were a movie, we might be tempted to get up and leave and find something happier, something other than this tragedy. Maybe you have felt that way reading the Old Testament at some point in your life. Before I learned to see the bigger picture, sometimes I was in that position where I thought, man, this is just depressing. Where could this possibly go? But we know that the story is not over yet. God was not finished with his people. God made a promise to his people that he would bring them back to Jerusalem and back to himself. When God makes a promise, something that he calls a covenant, he always keeps it. And this is where the Israelites actually learn a really important lesson that holds true to each of us for today. Your mess is no match for God's mercy. 70 years passed since the exile, And just as God promised, the Jewish people began to return to Jerusalem. The temple would be rebuilt. That's the book of Ezariah, and we read about that. But the walls of the city still lay in ruin. They were this constant reminder of Israel's brokenness and disgrace. And it's at this point that we are now introduced to Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah is living 800 or so miles away from Jerusalem in Persia. He has a very important role, a role of honor. He is a cupbearer for the king. Now, this is a really important role because, among other things, his job was to taste the king's wine to make sure it wasn't poisoned. Which, comes with its own risks, right? So the king would have seen him as quite valuable because it, potentially keeps him alive. And Nehemiah receives this word about Jerusalem, and he is just devastated. We read in Nehemiah 1, verses 3 to 6. They said to me, the remnant that remains from the exile there in the province are experiencing considerable adversity and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem lies breached, and its gates have been burned down. Now pay attention to Nehemiah's reaction to this news. It's amazing. It says, when I heard these things, I sat down abruptly, crying and mourning for several days. I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Then I said, please, O Lord God of heaven, great and awesome God, who keeps his loving covenant with those who love him and obey his commandments. May your ear be attentive and your eyes be open to hear the prayer of your servant that I am praying to you today, throughout both day and night, on behalf of your servants, the Israelites. I am confessing the sins of the Israelites that we have committed against you. Both I, myself, and my family have sinned. Nehemiah wept for people that he had probably never met. And he took the blame for things that other people had done. He mourned, he fasted, and he prayed. He made this his own. He knew what was at stake. This was not just about the physical renewal of a city, but spiritual renewal for God's people. Now, notice where it all starts for Nehemiah. Okay? But first, a question. When we're in a mess, what is the first thing we typically do? What do you normally do? I heard someone say panic. And that, more often than not, that is our first response. Maybe we get overwhelmed. Maybe we try to dive right in and take action. But Nehemiah, he immediately goes to the only one who can actually do anything about it. He prays. We see that rebuilding starts with prayer. And while praying, Nehemiah reminds himself of who God is. A great and awesome God who keeps his covenants of love. And then he asks God to hear his prayer as he confesses sin. His sin for not being involved in the rebuilding, and his people's sin for neglecting God's city. And he makes it his own, and he confesses for himself and for them. If you don't remember anything else, remember this. If you are looking for spiritual renewal in your life, prayer is the place to start. Now, Nehemiah prays for success with the king, and God grants it. You know, Nehemiah believes so much that this mess is no match for God's mercy that he is willing to put his own life on the line and go before the king, much like Esther did last week. You know, and Nehemiah's faith was well placed in God. Nehemiah himself would say, because the gracious hand of God was on me, the king granted my requests. And it's an amazing story. The king did more than just grant his requests to let him go back. He sent him with everything he would need for safe travel and materials to rebuild the walls. You know, God moved the king to provide for this effort. And Nehemiah, thanks to the king's escort, makes really good time to Jerusalem. And so now we have another lesson on rebuilding, or maybe a re-emphasizing. Once again, the first thing Nehemiah does when he gets there is not to jump to action right away. He first prays and observes the situation, then he goes to the people. Nehemiah 2:17-18 says, "Then I said to them, you see the problem that we have. Jerusalem is desolate and its gates are burned. Come on, let's rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so that this reproach will not continue." Then I related to them how the good hand of my God was on me and what the king had said to me. Then they replied, "Let's begin rebuilding right away." So they readied themselves for this good project. The people were eager to get started. But you know, not everyone shared their enthusiasm. There are some, like Sanballat, the governor of Samaria, who actually stood to lose quite a bit of political ground. And he accuses Nehemiah of rebelling against the king. Now we know, of course, that this is not true. He's actually been endorsed by the king. So when this didn't work, he tries to discourage Nehemiah. Nehemiah 4:3 says, "Then Tobiah the Ammonite, who was close by, said, if even a fox were to climb up on what they are building, it would break down their wall of stones." And Nehemiah responds by returning to prayer, even as his enemies return to the drawing board. You know, their next strategy when discouragement doesn't work is to start plotting to kill him. The walls keep going up, and so does their anger and their desperation to stop this. Sanballats and Tobias are still around today. Have you met one? I'd be surprised if you haven't. You know, you try to do what's right, and they just do you wrong. You try to pull yourself up, and they just pull you down. Be prepared. Don't be caught off guard. Notice what Nehemiah did. You know, he posted entire communities, families, at the lowest points of the wall, at the exposed places, so the work of rebuilding could continue and protect the workers at the same time. You have some people who would have a brick in one hand and a weapon in another. It's the same for us. We all have these exposed places in our lives, places of vulnerability and weakness. Who is standing guard for you? Are you trying to do life alone, or do you have others who can strengthen your defense in the places where you are most vulnerable? This is one reason, one need for the church family. There are people here, you connect with your family, and you have people who can strengthen you and help you with your vulnerabilities, support you. You know, this is an important question to consider. Are you trying to do it alone, or have you welcomed others into your lives to strengthen your defenses? Because we see Nehemiah's strategy frustrated the enemy so much that they never actually ended up making a move to attack. It's a good strategy. And now you see, God's people had not given up, but neither had the enemy. They make one last-ditch effort. And it's a powerful strategy because very few people ever see this one coming. They try to distract him. And this brings us to another point. Rebuilding requires focus. We see these people, the enemies, they couldn't discourage Nehemiah. They couldn't kill him, so they will try to distract him. Now, at this point, Nehemiah had rebuilt the walls, but not the doors in the gates. And so Sanballat and Geshem send this messenger. Nehemiah 6, 2-3 says, Sanballat and Geshem sent word to me saying, "Come on, let's set up a time to meet together at Kepharim in the plain of Ono." Now they intended to do me harm. So I sent messengers to them saying, "I am engaged in an important work, and I am unable to come down. Why should the work come to a halt when I leave to come down to you? Why should I go down to you? Don't you know I have a great project on the go?" Basically. You ever find yourself wishing that you had a great project for God? Guess what? You do. Everyone does. Whether you're single, married, raising children, an empty nester, grandparenting, rich or poor, you have been given a great project for the kingdom. It could be raising your children. It could be mentoring or discipling, in other words, someone. Or being mentored yourself into becoming more like Jesus. If that is the task God has put before you, that is your great task for the kingdom. And you know, sometimes, for example, my wife might hate me for throwing her under the bus here. Sometimes she has told me she struggles with parenting and feeling like she's not connected or involved with the church as much as she wants to be. But for her, the great task God has given her is to be a good mother who helps raise these children to love the Lord. That is her beautiful, amazing, great task. And she is amazing at it, and she looks embarrassed and angry right now. I love you. We all have our own great tasks. Maybe it's praying with or for a coworker, or offering a simple invitation to a neighbor to come over for a barbecue, or to your life group, or even to worship. It's probably not rebuilding an actual wall, but you never know. But it could be rebuilding a life. Maybe starting with your own. Your mess is no match for God's mercy. You can know, like Nehemiah, that God will fight for you. Because God really fought for his people. You know, they finished the wall. They set the doors in place, all in a measly 52 days. This was unheard of. It's still unheard of. Have you seen how long some of the building projects take today? Even with all our fancy equipment? I mean, if you read about the scale of these walls, how big the blocks were, how thick and long the walls are, it is unimaginable that it would take 52 days. God was absolutely involved in fighting for them, and he is absolutely involved in fighting for you. And so how did the people respond? They worshipped. Rebuilding leads to worship. Nehemiah 8:6. Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God, and all the people replied, Amen, Amen, as they lifted their hands. Then they bowed down and worshiped the Lord with their faces to the ground. Remember that story back at the beginning of Travis and his daughter Annie? Well, it turns out Annie was right to want to stay and see the ending of the movie, because despite all odds, there was actually a very happy ending. Now, as Travis walked out of the theater with his daughter, she was silent for a minute. And then Annie suddenly turns to him and says, Aren't you glad we didn't leave? Think about all we would have missed. Your mess is no match for God's mercy. And God's mercy today has a name. Jesus. When you give your mess to Jesus, God doesn't see what you've done. He only sees what Jesus did on the cross. Let the cross be how your story ends. Don't leave just because things get messy. Think about all you'll miss. Stick around. See how the story ends. And do what Nehemiah did. Start with prayer each and every time, always. And stay focused. Stay focused on God and on that great task he has given you. And man, take time to worship. Now I know we come here every week and we worship God, and I hope and pray that yes, it engages our minds, but that we pour our heart and soul into it. But man, take time to worship during the week too. You can worship God on your own. You don't have to be here with us too. Worship him all the time. You know, God was faithful to guide Nehemiah, and he will be faithful to guide you. Now, we're going to do something a little bit different to finish up today. Because I believe so strongly in prayer, in the power of prayer, and in its importance. We are going to emphasize this. And I'm going to emphasize it as much as I can for as long as I can. This morning will be a little bit unique. When I say go, and you don't have to actually get up and go, turn to the people around you. Make groups of 3 or 4 if you can, roughly, more or less is fine. and then pray for 90 seconds. Just 90 seconds. Anyone can pray for 90 seconds about something from this lesson. And then once the 90 seconds is up, we will have our final song and then announcements, and we will go out into the week and we will bring glory to the Lord. All right. Find your group. Get praying.